This is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm DonnFelker.
And I'm KaushikGopal.
Welcome to the show. So, Kaushik, I've been doing a lot of thinking about views lately. And so I think today's guest is only perfect for this topic. So why don't you fill the folks in and let them know what we're going to be talking about, and maybe you could introduce our special guest today.
Absolutely. So, this is something that's always been on our radar as a topic, custom views, custom view groups, widgets, and all that good stuff. But we've always been pushing it for the future. And we have the perfect guest today who is also a pro at this stuff. So we thought this would be an excellent opportunity to sort of chat about this topic with her. And without further ado, we have our good friend, Huyen. Welcome to the show.
Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So excited to be here.
So Huyen, we appreciate you joining us here on the show today. For the folks that haven't been introduced to you or don't know of you, it would be great if you could give us a little bit of background information on maybe how you got started in, the programming industry, how you got started with Android, maybe even where you're working now and the things that you're doing with Android. If you could give us a little bit of information, it would be great.
Oh, absolutely. So not to go back too far, but I got into programming when I was really young. And I started off thinking that I was going to go in the game industry when I got to university, and that kind of went away a little quickly. And then basically I got to web at some point, and it's actually pretty funny. My significant other was really into AOSP, and he was telling me about this cool Android thing. And I said, well, all right, well, let's give it a go. And we were both contractors. And then I just basically started doing Android, just kind of like as a transition from my previous tech. And I ended up loving it. And I've been doing it for about 7 years now. And I was a contractor for a really long time. But just recently, just last September, I joined the Android team at Trello.
Oh, nice.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
We have good friends at Trello.
Yes, we do. Was this the second person we've had on the show from Trello, right? We had Dan and now you. Excellent.
Got a good team there. Yeah.
Yes, we really do. And I believe I'm like the third person from Denver you've had on the show in the last few months or so.
That is true. Denver has this amazing Android scene. We have like a whole bunch of like crazy, amazing folks from Denver. So yeah.
Yeah.
What's up? Like, what's the secret there? Like, how do we get that kind of...
The altitude.
Oh.
So you're also one of the co-hosts of a great video, I don't know what you call it, video cast?
The YouTube channel.
YouTube channel. Okay. So the name of that is Android Dialogs. Can you talk a little bit about who you do Android Dialogs with, what you guys kind of talk about? It'd be great to get a little information on that because I know it's a super valuable resource.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. It's Chuki-chan and I. Chuki-chan also a developer in the awesome state of Colorado in Boulder. And we basically became friends. And I always had, I listened to Fragmented like when y'all first started a year ago. And I've always been kind of a podcast nut. And I think I always wanted to do my own. And then as we were becoming friends, I had this idea of doing short interviews, just because I have a very short attention span. So I figured, well, let me try doing something that's kind of really bite-sized and really kind of consumable. And I brought the idea to her before I/O last year. And and Chuki said, well, I have a camera. Let's do video. And I was like, well, I really like YouTube as well, so that sounds like a great idea. And so our idea was just basically to talk to people in the Android community and to get to know them, to learn from them, and to share in what everyone else is doing because the community is so broad. And I always feel like there's definitely, I think it's fair to say that there are people who are very Android famous, and people that at any level of Android, you probably will know or should know. But there's so many people who maybe aren't quite as Android famous, but are still doing amazing things that still have a lot of wonderful information and knowledge to share and are just cool people. There's just so many amazing people in the community. And basically what we do is we go to conferences, we go locally, and we just talk to people for 10 to 15 minutes or longer if we kind of get off the train or get off the rails. But we basically just love talking to people on Android and seeing what they're doing and sharing it with the rest of the community.
Awesome.
We'll definitely add a link to that in the show notes, and people can go back and see like your archive of like the different people that you've interviewed. It's like great stuff.
No, it's been a really great ride. And it's actually, we just passed our year anniversary of our first video. I think not this Sunday, but last Sunday. Yes, we've been doing it for a year. Thank you.
Congratulations. Yeah. So apart from Android Dialogs, you have recently also joined this site. I don't know what it is. Caster.io. I don't know the dude who runs that show, but I hear he's been doing some decent things there. So you recently joined, and I think you released your video. Is this maybe last week, I guess? Was it last week?
Well, yeah, just this last week. So I'm on board.
Yeah, and I must say, I've worked with custom views. Like anyone who's been working in Android development at least for some time usually runs into like custom views at some point, like we mentioned at the beginning of the show. And I must say, oh my God, like all those concepts that are sort of like independently existent in my brain, which never connected, just seeing your video, it all just like connected so well. So I highly, highly recommend your series. You only have one episode out, but I believe more episodes are coming. So I am eagerly waiting for those to ship.
Oh, thank you so much. No, it's actually, I love custom views. They're kind of one of my favorite things. I'm really excited for the opportunity to do this video series. And I mean, there's just so many facets to doing custom views. I mean, it's going to be fun, and I'm really excited to do it. But yeah, it's something that I've been really passionate about. And was actually kind of that very first Android project that I did. I got to basically start doing custom views and custom text rendering. So it's always kind of been part of my Android mind space.
Very nice. Yeah. And I mean, even as someone who has like some level of experience, I still had so much to learn from it. So I'm pretty stoked about this series, and we'll definitely add a link to that in the show notes.
Definitely. And if for those that are listening and wondering what lesson we're talking about, it's called Custom Views and ViewGroups, and it's lesson number 81 on Caster.io. Again, Huyen, thanks for that. I felt the same way as Kaushik when I watched the video for the first time around. Just this simple, the way you explained it was so simple and took these concepts, which are, again, as Kaushik said, kind of distant from each other, and you brought them together very nicely. So anyone who's looking to check it out, it is a free lesson that's on there. So definitely check it out. I think one of the biggest questions that a lot of folks have out there is like, why should I create a custom view, or why should I create a custom view group when there's all these other views out there? What's the benefit of doing so? And kind of is there any heuristics that I should follow, or anything of that nature? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, wow. So I have many thoughts on this. So, there's a lot of different reasons. And, I think the number one reason that, that was the reason that I got turned to custom views, is that a lot of times, there's so many different awesome widgets and views in the platform that you can use. And you could probably write, dozens of apps where you are totally happy just sticking with those widgets that are in the Android platform already. But every now and again, you might have a really interesting, innovative design or a complicated design, or you might be trying to do something new in terms of interactions, and you just can't make the platform widgets bend to your will. You can't quite get the behavior that you want. And so sometimes you just have to go custom, and, like this is actually my idea for going back to custom views kind of came from a talk that I do recently called Loving Lean Layouts. And the reason that it kind of came from that is that a lot of times custom views can also help with performance. So depending on like your view hierarchies, if they're very complex, if they're very deep, a lot of times doing custom work can help you flatten that hierarchy out, and that you can do less nesting and less kind of like layering of things on top of each other through doing custom views. Now, it's a lot more work, but if you really have performance problems, that's a really great way to go about it. And, just in general, in terms of like, if you have a big code base and you have like, like kind of view structures, like view layouts that have like parts that you're using over again, rather than copying and pasting things, you can use custom views and custom view groups to kind of make those a little more reusable and make them modular, and just kind of increase the modularity of your code. So there's quite a few different reasons to do it.
Now with performance, one of the big things, especially with why people start off, is like when you have like janky UIs, right? Like that's usually when people are like, why does this thing not scroll properly? So you're totally right. In terms of like performance, I guess like that's like one big win. And usually that's when people get working on custom views. So one big problem I have with custom views is when you actually use custom views, you don't get the layout preview. Does that annoy you in any way?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So that's like the big downside. No, so I'll admit that I am not. I had before like Google I came out and like the new layout editor and the constraint layout came out. I was not a huge fan of design view. And partly because of my love for custom views, it just wasn't, it just wasn't there for me. But I just tend not to use it as why. I'm kind of like, maybe I'm a little bit too focused on the XML. But so yeah, that is a big problem with it. And I mean, I've had projects where it compiles correctly, but like design view would show that awful red squiggly lines, like, oh, we don't know where this thing is. Like, no, it's right there. It's literally right there in the package. So it is a big disadvantage. And I think going forward, especially with things like constraint layout and the new layout editor, where we're kind of shifting to a more visual style. If it continues to be that custom views are hard to render in the design view, that will be a disadvantage. But at the same time, and that's kind of the thing though, I feel like if it doesn't work for you, if you need to kind of stay in a certain flow, whether it's for visual editing, whether it's for, some other reason, that, it definitely is a reason to consider not doing them. But again, things like performance, like when you have like really bad performance, it's like, that's like 1-star rating kind of like problems, and like, and at that point you kind of have to sacrifice the kind of like the efficiency and convenience to yourself as a developer and pass off those savings, I guess, to your users by using custom views. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that is a big problem. And I'm hoping one day that, I mean, it's kind of hard because of the nature of custom views for, I guess, to expect the tools team to just know exactly how things should be rendered. But yeah, it's definitely something that has made me stare very sadly at the design team many a time.
If now there's a whole bunch of edge cases inside of custom views and when you're evaluating whether or not you should implement one and so forth. But for those that are out there that are new to Android development, which there are a lot of us out there, how or what is a good heuristic to determine like what's something I could say, hey, this is a good thing that I should be using a custom view for? Like when do I know I should create a custom view rather than just creating a huge layout and copying it all over the place? Or do you have any of those kind of heuristics at all?
Yeah, definitely. That's something I really love. Heuristics and rules of thumb are my jam. So a lot of times, like very often, performance jank will pop up in list views just because of the nature of recycler views and list views is that you have tons of copies of this same item. And if that item is really complex, and you start trying to do things like swipe to dismiss and all that kind of fun stuff, that's when you can really get jank. And that was actually one of my personal anecdotal, oh my gosh, I need a custom view here because these list items are just too complex. We can't do them in a naive, straightforward kind of way. We need to go to custom view. So a lot of times with very complex, very dense, like recycler reviews and list items, custom views are a fantastic way to go. And I think that's a good rule of thumb.
The open question now is like, okay, so how do we go about custom views, right? Like, what are the different strategies and approaches that we can use? There's this gentleman by the name of Lucas Rocha. Can you like walk us through like some of the definitions? Because I understand there are different ways of like approaching custom views, right?
Yeah, no, there's different. So it's kind of weird because when you say custom, I tend to say custom views and view groups, but it all kind of falls into this idea of basically taking what the platform has and then doing something different with it or making something more of it. And I think Lucas has some really great definitions. The best, and I think one of the easiest places to start with custom views is what he calls composite views, and basically taking platform widgets and putting them together. So instead of actually building something completely on your own from scratch, just building something new from the platform itself. And then I think he goes on to talk about custom composite views, which is kind of going to the next level. Whereas instead of just using, say, a linear layout or relative layout and sticking things in it and making kind of your own view out of that, taking a custom view group or extending maybe a base view group and then doing your own like measurement and positioning. And then, so that's kind of like another level, right? And that again, and that's kind of just another way to kind of make it a little more custom, to get a little bit of more your own logic into it. And then was what he calls the flat custom view, which is kind of like what my first lesson was about on Castor.io. And basically, a lot of times when I say custom view, what I'm thinking about is basically doing a completely subclassed view and then doing all your own drawing yourself. I'll add something onto this, and this is also kind of another kind of gateway drug into custom views, and that's subclassing existing widgets. And this is kind of another way and this is something else that I do a lot. And so, for example, my last gig as a contractor, I would subclass text view so many times because we were, and a lot of times this is more just like small behavioral things. So if the widget does most of what you want, but doesn't quite do everything that you want, you can often just override and do things a little bit differently. So, for example, on my old gig, we were supporting gingerbread for a very long time. And so so there were a lot of like, say like the input type flags, right, that were supported in say like 11 and on, but we really wanted that functionality before, and we didn't want to have to like do everything kind of manually for each and every text view everywhere. So we would basically subclass text view and recreate a lot of that functionality in code. So it kind of saves us a little bit of, it kind of makes things a little bit more reusable for us in the code base. So that's also a really great way to start. And so I'm going to tack that on to Lucas's, classifications of custom view types.
Perfect. Yeah. And you mentioned like extending sort of like text views and sort of like the existing things. And that's actually one easy way I like to think about these strategies.
Yeah.
For example, like the first one, the composite view, if you're extending like linear layouts or like relative layouts, then you're basically like mangling with the composite views, because basically you're taking like these different views and you're just arranging them in an order. And one typical example is like if you have like an image and a text and an image, right? Like instead of using like compound drawables, which would possibly be the right way to go about that use case, when you extend like a linear layout or relative layout, then that's like the composite view. But then if you go and extend view group directly, and like as you rightly said, that's when you have to sort of like delve into like these methods on layout and like positioning. And then, of course, like the flat custom view, which is like what your first video was about, which is like extending views directly. At that, You're going at the ninja level there. Like at that point, you're like...
You have to override on draw at that point and when you're at the flat level, right?
Yeah, definitely. That's basically the bare minimum that you need to do when you're doing a custom view. Is just on draw and then do your thing. And then like, of course, if you need to do other things, you can like override on measure as well. And if you're talking view groups, you're going to be overriding on layout too. So... I think like an interesting thing about these different types though is that to go back to like heuristics and guidelines, a lot of times if you're just making you're just looking to make your code reusable and modular, you'll often find that you're pretty good with composite views. And maybe if you need a little more performance, you can go into custom composite views. But if you're kind of looking to go more very fine-tuned, highly custom like behavior or appearance, that's when you kind of start to shift towards like the other things like the flat custom views, or maybe like, again, with like behavior tweaks with the subclass widgets. So which of these you use can also depend on like kind of what your goals are as well. So
that's good. Good point. Depending on what you're going to do, you're going to use a different type of custom view, if it's flat, composite, etc. Now, I think one thing that all of these methods share behind the scenes is the view rendering process. And this is kind of where all the magic happens. The platform kind of takes over, but then some of your kind of code takes over when you hook into on draw, on measure, and all these different types of things. Can you, on the caster.io video, you did a great job explaining it. And I think the listeners would also benefit from that here. Can you explain how views are actually rendered in Android at a very simple level, like you did on the video?
Absolutely.
And I particularly like Huyen's title for this. It's basically how Android draws views, which like makes complete sense. Yeah.
So to be fair, there's actually a great document that goes into a lot more detail on it on the Android documentation that is called the same thing, how Android draws views. So if you want to go into super detail, you can check that out. But basically what happens is that after, say, you have your XML layout and it's inflated and the views are instantiated, there's several phases that have to happen before that layout gets to magically appear on the screen. And so there are 3 phases. The first is measure. And basically what happens is the Android platform will go basically from parents to children within your view layout. So this whole process is kind of this depth first traversal of the view hierarchy going from parents to children. And basically what happens is that each parent has a set of constraints for its children for how big they should be. And the parents will pass those constraints to the children, and the children take in those constraints and say, all right, well, given those constraints and given like what is inside, like what my content is, here's how big I want to be. And basically that goes down. And then once the children have done, the children will ask their children the same kind of questions about like, how big do you want to be, and go through all that. So at the end of it, basically every single view in your view hierarchy will have what's called a measured width or height. Basically a kind of guess at about how big it should be based on its constraints and based on its content. once that's all done, you get to the layout phase. Now, the layout phase is where the parents of children in your view hierarchy determine the ultimate positioning and size of that child, and that's based on, again, like the measurements that were done previously, and also just, again, like the specific algorithms or logic that parent wants to kind of follow in laying out its children. And again, that goes depth first search, depth first traversal of the tree from parents to children. The parents will lay out its children, the children will lay out their children, and so on and so forth, all the way down until you get all the views taken care of. And then finally, you get to draw. And basically, draw again, you start with the parents. The parents will draw themselves, so that generally when you're looking at a view hierarchy, the parents draw themselves, so they'll be at the bottom. And then the parents will say to each child, hey, go ahead and do your drawing thing. And again, down the tree, children will draw themselves, ask their children to do the same until the entire view hierarchy is drawn.
Now, is this the same for every view? Is it always work this exact way?
As far as I know, I mean, like that's just a basic, that is the behavior of the base view class that like the widgets and view groups extend from. So
perfect. That answers my question.
So when you mentioned constraints, right? Like, so there's like these three big methods: on measure, on layout, and on draws. So when the parent specifies the high level constraints, basically it's like the match parent, like the wrap content. So these are the things that we add as like layout sort of attributes on our view, right? And the parent basically says, okay, these are your constraints. Boom, go and measure yourself. Tell me how much like you can play around with like your measurements. One thing that always confused me before was like, it seems like there's like this back and forth kind of approach, because the parent says, okay, here you go, measure yourself. And the view's like, okay, I'm measured, here you go. And there's like, oh, okay, I got this measurement back. Now let's go and sort of like try to see and how we can lay people out, right?
So I actually have a slight metaphor that's not perfect, but that's great. So say that you're at like a pizza restaurant, right? And so like the menu of the pizza restaurant is like your layout parameters. Like the parent gives you these constraints. It gives you this menu of like kind of basically options for you, like things that you can have, like how big can your pizza be, more or less. And then you or not you, but sorry, the child is the customer, and basically based on what you're feeling like, how hungry you are, what kind of toppings you want, you're going to say back to the parent, back to the pizza shop owner, okay, well, I want this, this, and this. This is how big I want to be. And then the parent, the pizza shop owner, will try very, very hard to fulfill your order. But if they don't have this particular topping, or no, they don't have gluten-free pizza crust, I'm very sorry, like they'll do their best they can to fulfill your order, but you're going to end up with what you end up with. Now in real life, you could probably just leave the restaurant and like, but views aren't that lucky. And a lot of times when you have like kind of funkiness, like when views aren't laid out the way you expect, it might be because of this kind of disconnect in the process between what the view wants and what its parents might be able to give it. So
totally going to steal that. So one clarification though, because like one question that always pops up is like, well, how do I know which methods to implement? Because there's on measure, there's on layout, and there's on draw. And as I understand, you don't need all of these three methods, right? Like, I mean, how does that work? And in fact, I don't think there's like, do custom views, like the flat custom views, do they even have on layout or on measure? Because they're not view groups, right? So like, how does that all work?
So, I mean, like obviously they have the methods because those are defined within like the view class. But, in terms of like, so there's a little bit of a difference between views and view groups. So let me start at the top. So, if you're just doing a flat custom view, you actually only need to do on draw. And there's actually a lot of base behavior within the view base class that will do some of the measure for you. So you don't ever have to worry about your children having like no width and no height, because there is like default behavior that will take care of that. It's not, and the problem is that if you do on draw and just on draw, you can run into problems where things don't quite get sized the way you want. And so usually what I do is that, and I have to kind of check this, but you're kind of at the mercy of whatever that base class view behavior is, and basically how your draw operations will interact with that. And so if you kind of, and especially if you want to make views that are more reusable, and you want to kind of have a better control or just more options when you're laying out that custom child, that's when you want to say to yourself, okay, I'm going to do on measure, and I'm going to actually calculate how big my content should be, so that, that I'm not always like match parent, or I'm not always this particular size when my view is being drawn. And again, so on measure is very often important to flat custom views, even though you don't strictly need it. You probably do want to do it. Now on layout, again, you it's custom views generally, like when you're doing them, I know usually when I do them, they don't have any children, so you don't have to worry about it. Now with custom view groups, everything I said before is true with the on draw and the on measure. But on measure in more particular, because, a lot of times the size of the view group is very dependent on the size of the children. So you probably very definitely should do on measure for the view group, and you need to do on layout. And on layout is basically how your children will end up on the screen. If you do not, and so there's actually a method that you can call from within on layout on the children that's layout. It's just called layout. And that is the way by which the children will actually be drawn. If you don't call it, then they kind of end up in like, non-dimensional space somewhere. So on layout is absolutely like critical for doing custom view groups.
I got this great pizza analogy that I'd like to tell you. And the way it works is so you can go to the restaurant owner and basically tell them, I want a vegetarian pizza. And they're like, okay. And they can just like give you what you want. But if you override on measure on layout, you can say, well, actually remove the onions. I don't want the onions. I want if you want to add more like dimension and constraints, then you can sort of like, you can make sure that the vegetarian pizza that comes to you is like exactly the way you designed.
Nice. I'm feeling that one
too. Oh, well.
So we there's, these three methods: on draw, on measure, on layout. They do a bunch of different things, and I know some of them are called quite frequently in the Android lifecycle when views are rendered and so forth, especially in list views, all those recycler views, etc. Now, at some point, we have to start caring about performance, but at some point, we have to be pragmatic at the same time and say, do I really have to care about performance when I'm building this initially? Or when should I start looking for performance bottlenecks or anything in that area? Do you have, again, any additional rules of thumbs of when someone might need to start optimizing for performance and any tools they can use and so forth?
Absolutely. So it happens that you worry about performance when you start having performance problems, and that's a very good time to start worrying about it when you have jank in your UI. If you can, anticipate problems. Like if you do have a list view that's incredibly dense, that has a lot of data, try to do things in a more efficient manner. Try maybe thinking about doing custom views if they make sense, if they're efficient for you from the beginning. And then if you have to compromise sometimes, if you have to just crank a layout out or crank a UI out to get something out, that's fine. But always kind of pause and like if you're doing like a whole ton of features, you have to kind of pause and consider like where the bottlenecks are. And a lot of that can be done through using different tools. A lot of the problems that come with performance for layouts have a lot to do with basically how many times you're doing measure and layout and how much stuff you're doing in it. And there's quite a few great tools to do that, to kind of gauge like how much stuff you're doing with. And kind of a big one is systrace. And so the whole thing with jank, so janky UI, stutter UIs occur because, whenever the application is rendered to the screen, each frame that the user sees has to be drawn within a certain time frame. So the kind of like the gauge is 60 frames per second is smooth, is basically a smooth rendering. And to meet that kind of requirement, each frame has to be drawn in about 16.6 milliseconds. So the problem is if you do too much stuff, it's going to take longer than that. So a really great tool for that is systrace. And systrace basically gives you this really great visualization on basically execution times and of different methods that are going on. And it's really great because they're actually it actually gives you frame rendering information and frame rendering kind of evaluation. And each frame, there's this great little like F icon, and it'll let you know if you're kind of within that 16.6 milliseconds, if you're a little bit over, and if you're a lot over, and it shows you kind of like a great like green, yellow, red kind of color, just like, oh, hey, like, you're not doing so good, or hey, this is fine. And so it's a really great tool to use when you have that jank to kind of see like, and you can actually see like which methods also might be taking a little bit longer within the frame execution. So that's a really great tool. It's a little heavy, and obviously visually, it's pretty complex to use. So another great tool that's more just for visualizing your view hierarchy is the hierarchy viewer. And it basically takes your activities layout and creates a tree representation of it. And so it actually does have measurements of measure, layout, and draw, but I was told very specifically. So I gave this whole talk where I was like touting the wonderfulness of hierarchy viewer and saying, oh, look at these really cool metrics you have on the measure, layout, and draw. And actually Chet Haas came to me after my talk and said, all right, look, I'm going to might make you cry, but those aren't accurate at all. And I was like, really? And he was like, no.
Wow. Thanks, Chet.
Yeah. So thanks, Chet. No, but but he said he said very specifically that he thinks it's still a fantastic tool for visualizing, because visualizing is very important. And you get a really good 10,000 foot view of where you might have a lot of views, where your view might be incredibly deep. Because of this tree view, you can kind of see where things are bunched together or things are getting really, really long, really, really deep. So it's still a really great way of kind of getting a very macroscopic view of where you might have problems. So it's still very valuable. Don't use the numbers or Chet's going to come and make you cry. I'm sorry, Chet. I'm just kidding. But and there's some other great tools. There's Dumpsys, which is basically a tool that collects interesting information about kind of like different processes and dumps it out. It's called Dumpsys. And there's actually a couple of arguments you can pass to it about one's called GFX Info, which is basically and so there's GFX Info, and there's also GFX Info Frame Stats. And it's basically this really incredibly detailed like timing information on when different parts of the draw process happen. So if you want to get down to the fractions of a second of when measure occurred and when layout occur, you can do that. But once you get to Android N, you'll get this really cool Frame Metrics Listener API. And the Frame Metrics Listener API is basically dump sys frame stats, but in an API that you can access in the app that's not limited to 120 frames of history, because that's what frame stats is limited to. And again, you can get this incredibly detailed, like basically interaction level, I believe is what they call it, information about what's going on with your UI. So you have a lot of tools. Oh, and there's also, again, like using the GPU profiler as well, which is in Android Studio, and also things like, turning on overdraw and things like that to kind of see where that's happening. So you have a lot of different tools to kind of gauge, where you have a complex view, where do you have a lot of dense views? So things are overlaying and overdrawing, or like at what point, like, are you getting a lot of kind of like heavy GPU activity because maybe you're scrolling and you have a really, complicated view. So things are kind of going sideways here. So there's a lot of different ways.
That makes sense. In terms of the CPU and GPU, so this is one thing I've always and we're going to nerd out just a little here, so bear with us. And I've noticed like sometimes developers don't necessarily understand the distinction between what the CPU does and what the GPU does. Now, again, you don't necessarily need to know this for like your day-to-day Android development, but it's very helpful to know what these roles are, right? So here's the gist. I'm going to try to break it down like in a sort of simple fashion, and you folks should correct me if I'm saying something completely ridiculous. So primarily there's the CPU and the GPU. Now in the early 90s, what happened is people realized like there's this process called like rasterization, right? And what rasterization does is like if you have a representation of like a high level object, like you have like a button, you have a circle, you have text, you want to render that into pixels, because in the end on the screen everything just is like the sea of pixels, right? So like you want to render that onto the screen in terms of pixels. But what they noticed is like it's tricky to do this because like this the rendering of the pixels alone is quite intensive, and which is why in the early 90s they brought in this concept of a GPU, right? So the graphical processing unit. You also have the CPU, and the way these two connect is the CPU tries to build like these low level like building blocks. So like polygons, like textures, like just think of it like if you have a button and like if you like dive in microscopically and you try to break it down into sort of simple objects like, oh, this could be a rectangle. This could be like a combination of like 20 triangles or something. The CPU does the work in order to sort of build that the information there, and it ships it off to the GPU. And the GPU basically takes that. The GPU is amazing at taking these low-lying blocks and then boom, converting those to pixels, right? The GPU tends to be really good and fast about doing these things. And all of these things that we say, like having like a view hierarchy, having like a whole bunch of views, the idea is basically there are two very time-consuming processes. One is this process of converting to low-level objects, like if you have like a button and the CPU's converting it to these low-level objects, that the CPU does that, but it takes time to do that. And the second big time-consuming operation is taking all that information and shipping it to a GPU, because the CPU and the GPU are like very independent components on like any computer that you have. Like they're like physically different components. So moving that information from one component to the other also takes time. So like Huyen was saying, if you have like a whole bunch of views, basically it has to do all of that work for each of these views, right? And then each of those things take time. So like it's nice to understand the distinction between the CPU and the GPU. So when says like on measure, on draw, and all of these sort of like software-y kind of things that are talked about, it's all the CPU that basically does that work, right? And then when you have like the actual rendering into pixels, then it's like the GPU that steps in and does this, right? Does that make sense?
That was awesome.
That's really cool. Yeah. Very lovely.
Well, I hope I didn't say something completely wrong, and then we're going to get listeners say like, "You are a complete nut job. You have no idea what you're talking about."
No, that was a great bit of information there. It's the same way that I've grown to understand it as well.
I mean, in terms of like giving like specific tips per se, like for example, because one thing that always trips me up is also like the invalidate method, and this is like one of those key points that like after watching Huyen's video, like I want to also say what happens, but it's also like a teaser to the trailer of
spoilers.
Watching. Yes, the spoilers, but this is such an amazing, like for me, it just like clicked. I'm like, oh my God, that's what it is. Like, so Huyen, you have like this timer view, right? And maybe you should like walk us through.
Yeah. So basically like, so say you kind of optionally like implement on measure, you implement on draw, and you've got something really beautiful on the screen. Unfortunately, mobile applications are not static. So at some point, state will change, something will change. You might just want to entertain the user, and you'll have to re-render the view. So the thing is that in order to request that the platform kind of redraws or your view, you have to call invalidate. And basically invalidate is saying, well, just that. Well, I'm sorry, this view, like the current like drawn state of the view is no longer valid. It needs to go through another draw cycle. So basically, when you're trying to update the kind of rendering of your view, you need to call this invalidate method. And at some point, a message gets passed to like the main thread. And at some point, a draw pass will occur again. So you can kind of rerun through all your logic, and hopefully something has changed, and it will, that change will be reflected in the new drawing of your view. And there's quite a few ways to do it. So like the base like method is just no parameters, invalidate. So basically my whole view is like, I guess to use like the correct prompts, like the view's dirty, it needs to be redrawn again. But there's a lot of different variants of invalidate. If you want to get kind of fancy and you want to kind of like be a little more performant, if only a portion of that view is changed and you can get a good idea of coordinates or like an area for it, there's a couple of great variants of invalidate where you can pass like a rectangle that has both the position and the size of a subsection of your view, or there's like an invalidate, I think with like left top, right, bottom. It always confuses me that they don't do left, right, top, bottom. But yeah, so it's definitely an expensive operation, and you shouldn't just do it willy-nilly, but if you have to, you have to. And if there's a way for you to kind of more precisely designate parts of your view to redraw, there's alternatives for you. And again, if performance is an issue, then you should definitely kind of look into being a little more precise with your invalidation. But it's an important part, but it's also an expensive part. So it's always like this kind of balance of like, I want something to be really, lush and like, interactive and changing and beautiful. And I want to do all kinds of things with my view, but you also have to, scale it back a bit if you have performance problems. So.
Right. And in terms of your example, like with the timer text view, right? Like you chose like the perfect example, because without calling invalidate, what happens is like with the very first rendering, it shows this beautiful timer like circle with a text, but the text doesn't change because like you rightly said, like the state has to change. And when the state has changed, and when the state changes, you basically call invalidate, so it like refreshes, right? That just clicked so well for me. I'm like, oh my God, now I totally understand what's happening.
Yeah, now to go with this conversation, if I wanted to make that even more efficient, now in the lesson, I just call invalidate. But for the time review, the only thing that's really changing is that number in the middle. So if I could get a very good, erect or positions that would just kind of like box in that particular text in the middle, I could call invalidate with erect or left top, right bottom and make it even more efficient, especially with something like a timer where it's the timer's not so bad. It's every 200 milliseconds, which I guess in computer time is not so fast. But again, because it's happening, very, very periodically and kind of often enough, making it efficient wouldn't be a bad thing. It is not too hard to do. So that's a tip for people that watch Cast.io videos and listen to the podcast. So,
boom, winning all over.
Now, there's like also, as I've read in numerous places, that various allocations on draw can be a humongous problem. Is that true?
Yes, that is very true. And just because, depending on what you're doing, depending like, animations and all this kind of thing just triggers so many updates, so many invalidations, so many redraws that if you're allocating in that call, just think about how much memory you're just like using up if you're just calling on draw over and over and over and over and over again. They're really bad. And it's actually a lint warning that pops up. If you allocate any objects in on draw, lint will yell at you. And that's kind of like one of my big things. You kind of want to pay attention to lint when you're doing performance problems. So when you're using, say, like text paint objects, rect, any of those geometric objects, usually the best thing to do is instantiate them maybe in your constructor or just somewhere else. And then I wouldn't even if you can do it in your constructor, that's awesome. But basically instantiate objects that you need to draw elsewhere, usually in the constructor. And that way you instead of like creating new objects, just kind of overwrite them, reset methods and things like that. And this gets a little bit sticky with things like static layout, which you use to render text and which is a great helper because it allows you to kind of wrap text, where draw text that I use in Lesson is a lot more kind of very explicit kind of brute force way of drawing text. Static layout is a lot more graceful and does wrapping, but static layout, you can't actually change the properties. You have to just create it. So you have to kind of get very careful and very inventive about how you instantiate these objects. So it's really important to not do that.
So we have a bunch of resources here we're also going to add to the show notes here, and I'm just going to kind of run through them real quick. We have, of course, Huyen's popular caster.io video, which is custom views and ViewGroups, so we'll link that. You also have a talk that is on YouTube. It's called Loving Lean Layouts. Where was that one from?
Actually, I've given that talk at several places. I first gave it at the Big Android Barbecue last year. And it's basically kind of, but there's a bunch of different recordings. I did it in DroidCon Berlin, DroidCon Italy, DroidKagi in Japan. So there's a couple of different places to find it.
Excellent.
I think I watched your talk at DroidCon SF as well.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
We also have the other article we discussed earlier, which is Lucas Rocha's custom layouts article, and that's where we talk about the composite view, the flat view, and so forth. So definitely take a good look at that one, as it has a bunch of good information in it. There's also a training video by New Circle. It's called Enhancing Android UI with Custom Views. So that's another great useful video. And here's one that I learned a ton from. That's from Erik Burke at Square, and it's Taming Android UIs. This is such a good video. It's been around for a while, but it's still a classic. And finally, of course, the fine folks over at Google on the Android team have released the Android performance patterns, custom views, and performance video. So definitely check those out. These will all be linked in the show notes.
And these are like very interesting people. For example, like you mentioned Lucas Rocha, right? So he is ex-Firefox. I think he was in Firefox and he did some amazing work there. Now I believe he's at Facebook.
Oh, wow.
So like, it's super interesting. Erik Burke, obviously like one of the early folks at Square. He worked with like Crazy Bob, Jesse Wilson, I imagine, a whole bunch of those folks. And New Circle, our friend Devin Wyatt.
Dave, who was on a couple episodes as well.
Yeah. Huyen, thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's so much fun always to chat with you, Huyen.
Yeah,
thank you
it's
so
always
much.
so good to see you too. No, it's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
If folks want to reach out to you, what's like the best way they can do that?
Oh, I am super active on Twitter, and you can find me there at Queen Code Monkey. And of course, at Android Dialogs, it's youtube.com/Android Dialogs, like the component, not like the actual proper English word.
Oh, yeah.
And and I keep a website blog at randomlytyping.com.
Excellent.
Sweet. And you can find the show notes for this episode at fragmentedpodcast.com/episodes/47. If folks want to reach out to you, Don, what's the best way to do that?
They can find me on Twitter at DonnFelker, or you can go to DonnFelker.com.
Perfect. And I am Kaushik Gopal on Twitter, and KAUSH.co is my website. So thank you all for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was a tablet that's on the table. Let me actually throw it against the wall. That's the problem with having two Android developers in the house. You've got like devices everywhere and you have no idea anymore.
A tablet? What are you doing with a tablet? Just
it's a Pixel C that we're supposed to test on different devices.
At least it wasn't the iPhone sound.
Oh, that's true. That's true. It's true. It's true. It's true.